Hey budget gardeners, Vita Loca here. Join Winnie and I as we talk about seedling heat mats. So let's go. I love seedling heat mats. I think they're great, especially if you like starting seeds indoors under grow lights. This video is going to talk all about what seedling heat mats are, why you would use them, how long you would use them, and when you would not use them. Seedling heat mats are also referred to as propagation mats. Even though I've been growing plants indoors under grow lights or LED shop lights for over 20 years, last year was my first time purchasing and trying out seedling heat mats. This video is going to cover a lot of different things when it comes to heat mats. And I did a lot of research for myself, and I wanted to share with you my findings to help you out to figure out, do you need heat mats or do you not when you start seeds, either indoors or outdoors? And while I'm sharing my findings with you, I'm just going to be putting away some flower seeds that I had collected during this past season. The first question you might have is, what is a seedling mat? It's basically made of durable, flexible PVC material, and it's waterproof, and it usually has contained within it some sort of heating element. And what it does is it offers seedling trays warmth and maintains a steady temperature, or it achieves a specific temperature range. And it often increases the germination rate and speed for seeds to sprout. Another thing that the mats do is they help seedlings develop their roots as they grow. You usually also end up with uniform germination and sprouting, which is really nice. One thing that I found interesting during my research was that heat mats help lessen the chances of certain fungal diseases like damping off, because with the heat that's provided, it dries off the soil a little bit. And so the chances go down for the initial onset of fungal diseases. Heat mats come in lots of different sizes. The ones that I have are 10 inches by 20 inches. And that size is perfect for the typical type of trays that you would buy that are the same size, 10 by 20. However, you can put smaller size cell packs in trays on top of your heat mat. And heat mats also come in larger sizes. It really depends on what your needs are and how much room you have in your grow space. Heat mats are designed in such a way so that they actually increase the soil temperature in the root zone by at least 10 degrees. And you're comparing that to the ambient temperature in the air. In fact, some heat mats may even increase the temperature as much as 20 degrees. It really depends on if you have a heat mat that has a thermostat on it or if you have one without a thermostat. For me, I actually have both because I wanted to test out both kinds of heat mats, and I don't have a personal preference on one over the other. They're very easy to use. You plug them into the wall and you basically leave them on. You don't put them on with a timer. They stay on all the time while they're in use. And not only that, they're actually very inexpensive. A typical heat mat will range somewhere in the ballpark of $10 to $20 per heat mat. Some people might think that it's expensive to run some of these mats, but actually it's not. They're very inexpensive to run. In fact, they're usually low wattage. Many of them are energy efficient, and you're only using them for a short period of time during your growing season. And in case you're wondering, all right, so who needs a heat mat? At a very high level, you could be a home gardener and you might find a use for them, or you might be growing things on a larger scale. Maybe you're a farm or a nursery, and definitely I would say both types of gardeners can use heat mats. And in terms of when is the best time of year to use a heat mat, typically it's during the winter months. Because when you think about it, the winter is the coldest part of the year. So that's when you would need to increase the temperature of the soil that you're planting your seeds in. If you were to start some seeds in cell packs, you don't need to increase the temperature of the soil, usually during the warmest days of the summer. And that's why you're normally using these types of mats during the winter months. So just like you, I had a lot of questions. Why would I want to use a heat mat? Do I use a heat mat for all different plants, annuals, perennials, vegetables, herbs, flowers? Are there any times when you wouldn't want to use a heat mat? There are still so many questions, and fortunately, I do have some answers to some of those questions that you might have. Basically, anytime you want to increase the soil temperature of some seeds that you're trying to germinate, those are the times that you want to use a heat mat. And heat mats typically make most seeds germinate faster. And there are times where you need seeds to germinate very quickly for you. For example, maybe you've fallen behind on sowing some of your seeds in the growing season and you need them to germinate faster. That would be one example. Or let's say that you have a backyard plant nursery like I do, and I want to have a whole bunch of tomatoes sprouting very quickly because the growing season is in full swing and I need those tomato seeds germinated. Then I would use a seed mat. There's a number of instances when you would actually want to use it. Now, different resources will tell you different things, but on average, most seeds need somewhere between 65 to 85 degrees soil temperature in order to germinate. Now, that temperature range is quite large, and the reason for that is different seeds require different temperature in order to germinate. Now, even though I gave you that temperature range, let's say we talked about a higher temperature range. Let's say you had a seed mat and you just cranked it right up to something like 95 degrees. Believe it or not, that is too hot for most seeds. In fact, you might get very poor germination, or you might get some plants that produce and germinate, but they might be deformed. So you also don't want your soil temperature to be too hot. Now, we all are growing in a different situation when it comes to starting our seeds. A lot of times, let's say we have a grow room space, or we have a grow area outside where we're starting our seeds. The temperature will be quite different. For example, in my house, the temperature during the daytime is typically somewhere around 67 to 69 degrees Fahrenheit, and this is during the winter months. And during the nighttime, we turn the heat down. So it might get as cold as about 58 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit in my house. Now, you might be starting your seeds in your basement or in a very, very cold area, even like a garage or something. And that means that your ambient temperature, air temperature, is very cold. In that case, I would highly suggest you invest in at least one heat mat. But if your house stays warm all the time, around 70 degrees Fahrenheit or somewhere in that range, most likely a lot of the seeds that you're trying to start will germinate without any problems at all. So you might not even need to invest in even one heat mat. So at this point, hopefully you're starting to get a general idea on whether or not you might need a heat mat based on your grow room and the ambient air temperature during the day and night in that space. But then another thing to consider is what kind of plants will you be growing? Because that also will dictate whether or not you might want to invest in a heat mat. During my research, I looked into some vegetables, herbs, as well as flowers that may benefit from the use of a heat mat. Typically, any plant that's considered tropical or heat loving, those are plants that you would want to most likely use a heat mat to help with germination. And I've gone ahead and I've put together a list of a lot of plants that would benefit from the use of a heat mat. I might be missing some plants, but I tried my best to put together this list for myself and I wanted to share it with you. For vegetables, we have beans, corn, cucumber, eggplant, melons, okra, peppers, pomegranate, pumpkins, tomatoes, and zucchini. For herbs, there's basil, lavender, and rosemary. Flowers that would have better seed germination include angelonia, begonia, blanket flower, celosia, coreopsis, cosmos, cleome, delphiniums, gomphrena, hibiscus, lantana, marigold, pentas, salvia, sunflowers, verbena, lisianthus, petunia, yarrow, and zinnia. Now, you can always look at the back of your seed packet, and it may include information on the soil temperature requirements for that particular seed that you're trying to grow. But there are also numerous websites out there, and I like to go to seed companies like Johnny Select Seeds to basically look up a plant that I'm trying to grow from seed. And a lot of times when I go on that website, I can find some useful information on what is the soil temperature requirement for that particular seed that I'm trying to grow. And well, you know, I love to collect my own seeds from lots of different plants. So in that case, I don't have a seed packet that I can refer to. So going to a company that sells seed and checking out the soil temperature requirements to germinate a particular seed is very helpful. So I mentioned earlier that last year was my first time buying a seed mat. And I didn't do all my homework. I didn't do all my research. The seed mat didn't really have a lot of instructions on it. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to make this video, was to share with you my findings and my research. But I can share with you that last year I made a rookie mistake. And I used my heat mats to start almost all my seeds. And what I found out is actually there are times that you don't want to use a seed mat. Well, we know that there are plants called cool weather plants in the flower world as well as with vegetables. And well, honestly, those cool weather crops typically don't like a soil temperature that's warm. And when you think about it, it actually makes sense, right? So if those cool weather plants like cool weather, they're not going to like warm temperature. Well, they're definitely not going to benefit from a heat mat. So if you were to use a heat mat with a cool weather plant, like let's say peas or lettuce, you may get germination. The germination rate may be low. And with the plants that do germinate, they actually might end up being very tall, very scraggly, very leggy, and they won't be very good plants. So you actually don't want to use a heat mat with cool loving plants, generally speaking. Those cool weather plants like it nice and cool. They want their soil temperature typically somewhere around 55 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. But with all that said, let's say you're starting some lettuce seeds in an extremely cold room. Maybe you do need a heat mat in that case for your lettuce seeds, just to get them to barely sprout, barely germinate. That would be one situation where you may consider using a seed mat to start some of those cool crops. And there's also another time when you don't want to use a heat mat. And it's right after a whole bunch of your plants have germinated on the heat mat. In other words, let's say you were starting your lavender seeds and they've all come up, they've all germinated, and they were on the heat mat. At that point, you want to remove that tray off of the heat mat. You no longer want to keep those plants on the heat mat. And there's a number of reasons for that. There's actually no benefit for leaving them on there. Also, the water is going to evaporate very quickly off the soil, making the soil dry out super fast. And as those plants are growing and the roots are growing, they're going to need more water. You don't want to be having the water evaporate away from the roots. And then finally, those plants will end up getting leggy and they may actually die. So once you have plants that have germinated on your heat mat, you want to remove them off the heat mat. Again, if your grow room space is extremely cold, I don't even know, maybe 45-degree Fahrenheit grow room, in that case, then you may want to keep your marigolds or your heat-loving plants on the heat mat so they don't get too cold in that room. But generally speaking, most of us are growing in a grow room that's warmer than that. Now, unlike your grow lights or shop lights that you have turned on for maybe 14 or 16 hours a day, when it comes to a seedling heat mat, you actually want to leave it on the full duration of time from when you've put your trays on the heat mat up until germination. When you see germination, then you would pull the seedlings off of there. In other words, you're not putting the heat mat on a timer. You're leaving it on 24 hours so that the heat can stay consistently warm. You know, back in the day when I first started growing plants from seed, I had heard that many plants will benefit from bottom heat. And I had heard that you could take your trays and put them on something that is warm, something like a refrigerator or one of those big freezers. You could put your trays on top of that because some amount of heat is coming out from the top of those. And I've even heard water heater is a great place to put your trays on for getting some of that bottom heat. Well, I also found some other fun ways of just providing bottom heat if you don't want to buy a heat mat. And some of those ways included, you could use string lights, you can use a radiator or a heat vent, and just make sure that it's not too hot. You could use something that your pet has, which would be something like a pet bed warmer or a reptile heating mat. But then there might be some things that you might think you can use. And let me tell you, you cannot use them. It's not a good idea. You would definitely not want to use a heated blanket, and you also don't want to use a heating pad. Why? Because both of those actually get way too hot and they're not waterproof, so it's not safe. And then finally, it's not safe to keep either of those on constantly for an extended period of time. So now I want to share with you what are some other uses for your seedling propagation or heat mats. And you're going to laugh at these ones. Maybe you already know about them, but I didn't know about them. You could use them to make yogurt, kombucha, bread, beer, or to warm your kitty. I don't know, I read that one, I had to laugh. I have 3 cats, and something tells me they probably would like to sit on the heat mats if they could. So I really hope this video helped you with determining whether or not you should use a heat mat. And if you do have a heat mat, in helping you determine which kind of plants would benefit from it. So let me know if you have a heat mat, and if you do, tell me some of your success or failure stories. I'd love to hear them. And if you learned anything new from this video, that makes me really happy, because I'm going to be making a lot more videos having to do with seed starting. In fact, I have a whole playlist that has to do with seed starting and growing under lights. I'll put a link to that playlist in the description below. And until the next video, make it a great day with gardening.